Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to discuss medical imaging. The first thing to understand about a lot of different medical imaging techniques is that they involve the interaction of light or electromagnetic radiation with different parts of the body. So before we can really start talking about specific imaging techniques, we need to understand the nature of electromagnetic radiation. So, electromagnetic radiation, in physics terms, exists simultaneously as both a wave and a particle. Now, for our understanding of electromagnetic radiation, we need to understand its wave properties. So, its wave properties are going to cause different kinds of light to have different types of wavelengths and energies. So if you actually look at the wave-like behavior of electromagnetic radiation, there's a couple of new terms that we're going to need to introduce here. The first is the amplitude of the light. If you imagine an imaginary dotted line going through or bisecting the waveform of the light so that it splits it into two halves, the amplitude represents the height of each individual peak. And what this amplitude is going to reflect is how intense or how bright the light is. More importantly, if we look at the wavelength or the actual distance between two consecutive points on two consecutive waves, what we're going to see here is that the wavelength is actually inversely proportional to how much energy is associated with that particular type of light. So what that's going to lead into, of course, is a discussion on the different types of light that exist in our world. So what you can see here is, as we said, there is an inverse relationship between energy and wavelength. The idea here is that the smaller the wavelength or the shorter the wavelength for a type of light, the more energy that light is going to have. And conversely, the longer the wavelength is, the less energy that light is going to have. So what we can see here is that on the long end of the wavelength spectrum, we have radio waves, which are all around us. There are thousands of radio stations and TV stations all throughout the country and all throughout the world that are constantly broadcasting signals. And what we deal with is we are constantly being bombarded with radio waves that are constantly penetrating our bodies. The reason we don't worry about this sort of thing is because since radio waves have such long wavelengths, they have very, very, very little energy associated with them. So since the light that is constantly bombarding our bodies and our tissues have so little energy, they pose very little threat of damaging our cells or our tissues. Infrared radiation has shorter wavelengths than radio waves, but still infrared radiation is still fairly long wavelength radiation and therefore has very little energy associated with it. On the short end of the spectrum, you have gamma rays, which are the shortest type of wavelength radiation that's known to exist. Since the wavelength is very short here, gamma rays have an extraordinarily large amount of energy associated with them, so gamma rays are extremely dangerous. X-rays have very short wavelengths too, not quite as short as gamma rays, but X-rays are very high energy types of radiation that are of course dangerous, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Ultraviolet radiation is fairly short wavelength radiation, has quite a bit of energy associated with it, and of course you can associate ultraviolet radiation that comes from the sun with sunburns that you get due to overexposure to the sun. This little sliver right here in the middle represents what is called the visible light spectrum. All these other types of radiation that we've been talking about are types of light that we actually cannot see with our eyes. The visible light spectrum represents the colors that the photoreceptor cells in the back of our eyes actually are capable of detecting and sending that information along to our brain so that we can interpret images. So the visible light spectrum represents wavelengths that range from about 350 nanometers to about 800 nanometers. And of course, a nanometer is equivalent to 1 × 10 to the -9th meters, to give you an idea of just how short these wavelengths are in the grand scheme of things. So the idea here is that the shorter wavelengths are going to represent the purple and the blue colors, and then the longer wavelengths are going to represent the oranges and the reds. So the main thing we need to understand moving forward in our study of different types of medical imaging is that there is this relationship between wavelength and the amount of energy that is associated with a type of radiation. And if we're going to be utilizing electromagnetic radiation and how it interacts with different cells and tissues in the body, we need to be aware of that energy wavelength relationship, because high energy light can pose some sort of risk of damaging living tissue. So that's something we need to be aware of. So one of the major benefits of medical imaging techniques is that since we are using the ability of electromagnetic radiation to interact with living tissue, we can actually get pictures and ideas of what the inside parts of the body actually look like. We can actually look at the internal anatomy of someone's body without having to resort to something as crude as a dissection. But like we said, the thing we have to be aware of and we have to take caution of is that we need to remember that relationship between wavelength and energy when we're discussing these techniques. The first technique we will talk about is X-rays. X-rays, of course, contain more energy than UV radiation, but of course less than gamma radiation. So X-rays are fairly high energy types of wavelengths of light. So the idea here is that X-rays will penetrate very hard and dense tissue like bone, but will be absorbed and deflected by softer tissues like connective tissue, fat, things of that nature. So what this is going to do is give you a picture that provides a very high amount of contrast between bone and everything else. So if you look at this picture here, you can see bones, and then you can see kind of a haze of the softer tissue around it. But as we said, radiation dosage is a major concern for both the patient and the practitioner, which is why you will often see both the patient and the practitioner being shielded by some type of lead apron or something like that to protect the more sensitive parts of the body, especially the gamete-producing cells in the ovaries or testes, depending on whether you're a woman or man. The next technique, which is highly related to the X-ray, is the CT scan. A CT scan, CT standing for computed tomography, the CT scan utilizes multiple X-rays that are taken at different depths of exposure to tissue. So you can think of these as like slices. So if you look at this picture from your textbook, this CT scan was performed on someone's brain, and the idea here is that the X-ray radiation was exposed to different areas of the brain, and each little snapshot of different parts of the brain can then be put together to form something that kind of looks like a three-dimensional image. So this can allow for better visualization of soft tissue because you're using multiple different pieces of information and then kind of assembling them all together like a puzzle piece. So a CT scan is not usually going to be used for bony, hard tissue because a standard X-ray is usually good enough for that. But if you really need to look at soft tissue, then a CT scan may be the way to go. But obviously the concern here is that since an X-ray is a big enough concern as far as radiation exposure goes, a CT scan is even more of a radiation concern because you are involving multiple X-rays rather than just one. Next we'll talk about MRI, which stands for magnetic resonance imaging. In this case, the patient is not really exposed to electromagnetic radiation. Instead, the patient is exposed to a strong magnetic field. So the idea here, and we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty atomic physics of what's going on here, so I'll just kind of give you the general idea. The idea here is that when atoms in the body and in the cells of the body, when atomic nuclei containing odd numbers of protons are exposed to a magnetic field, they start giving off radio waves. It's these radio waves that are being detected by the MRI machine. So the idea here, and we could spend a lot of time talking about this, the most common type of atom in the body that has an odd number of protons is hydrogen. So hydrogen is an atom that just has one proton. So MRIs are mostly going to be taking a picture of all the hydrogen that is in the body. And the most common places you're going to find hydrogen are in the water that is everywhere in the body, and then also fat molecules that are found in fat deposits all over the place. So the MRI in this regard is going to be good at looking at much softer tissue, certainly much better than the standard X-ray. Next, we'll talk about the PET scan. The PET in this case stands for positron emission tomography. So some of the previous techniques that we've looked at, some of the downsides of them, is that they provide only snapshots of anatomical features. You're really only taking essentially a Polaroid photograph of a particular anatomical structure at that point in time. So the nice thing about a PET scan is that a PET scan utilizes radioactive substances that are injected into the body, and then in real time we can actually look at the distribution of these radioactive substances as they go throughout the body. The idea here is that we can make strategic choices of what kind of radioactive substance or radiopharmaceutical, and this can actually allow us to measure physiological function in real time. So this example comes from your textbook. This is a PET scan being performed on a patient. This patient was injected with radioactive glucose. Glucose has a molecular formula of C6H12O6. What makes this particular kind of glucose radioactive is the carbon atoms in this glucose are labeled with carbon-14, which is a radioactive isotope of carbon. So we will be talking about more about isotopes in a future video, but the basic idea is that this particular kind of glucose is radioactive because we have replaced the normal carbon in this glucose with the radioactive form of it. So what you're seeing here is that the portions of this person's body that are lighting up is not only the brain, which is not quite so visible here because the picture is not quite so focused on it, but also two different tumors that are present in the body. The idea of this technique in this regard is that glucose is used primarily by cells in the brain and then tumors. Both of these kinds of tissues are very highly reliant on glucose metabolism, so if you inject someone with glucose, that's going to be the places where glucose distributes the most heavily. And the last technique that we will talk about is ultrasonography. Again, this is not really a technique that involves exposing tissues to electromagnetic radiation, but in this regard, ultrasounds produce images based on how high-frequency sound waves interact with tissues. So it's still very much kind of the same idea and same concept here. Now, ultrasounds are very nice. The upside is that they are very safe and therefore are very useful for techniques that involve very sensitive subjects or very sensitive tissues, especially pregnancies. You do not want, as a practitioner, you do not want to do an X-ray on a pregnant woman unless you absolutely have to. If you just need to get a look at what the baby looks like inside the pregnant woman's uterus, then ultrasounds are absolutely the way to go due to how safe they are. So, in addition to pregnancies, ultrasounds can be used for vascular studies, so looking at blood flow through different blood vessels, and also for looking at other organs that are really not hidden behind bone, things like the heart and the thyroid. Now, the downside to ultrasounds, they're obviously very safe, but the downside is that the image quality that you're going to get is usually going to be relatively poor in contrast to some of the higher end techniques like X-rays and CT scans that we've talked about before. Resolution is also an issue, resolution referring to the ability to distinguish two nearby objects as two separate objects. Okay, that's going to wrap it up for this video. We will talk about specific cases of applying this knowledge in the future when we start talking about specific organ systems. But for now, that's going to do it. So here is a list of vocabulary terms I think you ought to be aware of after watching this video. And as far as checking your understanding goes, I have a few questions for you. Number one, how are light wavelengths related to the amount of energy the light carries? Number two, what sort of danger does short wavelength radiation pose to living cells? Number three, What sorts of molecules and tissues will an MRI illuminate most prominently? And then finally, what are the benefits and limitation of each kind of technique that we discussed in this video? All right, that's going to do it. If you have a question, go ahead and leave it in the comments section, and I will see you next time. So long.